They tied her to a horse to steal her ranch, but she survived and returned with an untamable ally. The air in the Red Creek Corral was sun-scorched thick with brutal injustice and the smoldering hatred in her stepbrother's eyes. It was a place for breaking horses, but today it was for breaking a woman. Samantha Sam didn't scream as Clay cinched the rope tight around her wrists. Dust and grit clung to her tearless face, a mask of unbreakable will. He had bushwhacked her, framing her for horse theft to steal the ranch that was her birthright. The whole town watched silent and complicit as he tied the other end of the rope to a half-wild gelding. He thought he was sentencing her to death, but he didn't know her secret. A silent language with horses, a bond with the legendary stallion Phantom that he could never understand. "Enjoy the drag," Clay sneered, raising his whip. Sam met his gaze not with fear, but with a promise of reckoning. She had more grit than this whole dusty territory. But first, she had to survive being torn apart. Dawn at the Red Creek Ranch was a sacred thing. It crept over the eastern ridges, spilling cool gray light onto a land that Sam considered her only true church. She stood in the main corral, the sweet, warm breath of the horses misting around her in the morning chill. She murmured to them a low, soft language that had nothing to do with words. It was a language of shared spirit, a legacy passed down from her father, a man who could speak to the soul of a horse. The crunch of boots on gravel broke the peace. Mourning little sister Clay set his voice a jarring note in the quiet symphony. He leaned against the corral fence, his arms crossed. He wasn't looking at the horses. He was appraising them, his eyes calculating sums of bone and muscle. "Counting your inheritance already," Sam didn't turn. She ran a hand down the powerful neck of a chestnut mare. "They're not an inheritance, Clay. They're family. Sentiment." He scoffed. "Sentiment doesn't pay the bills." He was the son of her father's second wife, a boy who had arrived with a bitter heart and had grown into a man with greedy hands. He saw the ranch not as a living, breathing legacy, but as a plot of land to be carved up and sold to the highest bidder. The tension between them, always simmering, had grown cold and sharp since their father's passing last week. She left him there, walking toward a separate, heavily reinforced corral at the edge of the property. Inside, a legend lived, a creature of midnight and fury named Phantom. He was a wild black stallion, a magnificent beast her father had captured but never broken. He was the untamed heart of Red Creek. As Sam approached, the stallion stopped its frantic pacing. He watched her with an intelligent, wary eye, his powerful body a coiled spring. Clay wouldn't dare come within 10 feet of the fence, but Phantom allowed Sam into his space. She didn't try to touch him. She just stood her presence, a quiet offering of respect. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "That horse, Sam. His soul speaks the same language as yours." Later that morning, the final piece was shattered in the stiff, leather-scented air of her father's study. The lawyer, a grim-faced man from town, cleared his throat and unrolled the will. The first part was simple. The land, the house, the assets, all to be divided equally between his two children, Samantha and Clay. A smug, victorious smirk flickered across Clay's face. He had won. The lawyer, however, had not finished. He adjusted his spectacles and read on. One final clause, he stated, his voice flat. Regarding the future and stewardship of the Red Creek brand. The breeding rights, the family name, and the ownership of the stallion known as Phantom shall pass to the one child who proves themselves worthy by riding him before the first snows. The room fell silent. The air crackled. The clause was a key designed for a lock only Sam could open. It was her father's final testament, a declaration of who he believed was the true heir to his spirit. Clay's smirk evaporated, replaced by a mask of pure, choleric rage. He slammed his fist on the heavy oak desk, the sound like a gunshot. "He's mocking me!" Clay roared, his face turning a deep, ugly red. "Even from the grave, the old man is mocking me." "The terms are quite clear, Mr. Clay," the lawyer said, unmoved. Sam looked at her stepbrother, her own quiet grief mixing with a steely resolve. "It was his way, Clay," she said, her voice low but firm. "He believed worth is earned, not just given." Clay shot her a look of venomous hatred, a look that promised a terrible retribution. Without another word, he stormed from the room, slamming the door so hard a portrait on the wall rattled. Sam was left alone in the sudden quiet, a cold sense of victory mingling with the deep, foreboding dread. She walked to the window and looked out. Across the dusty yard she saw Clay in a low, furious conversation with the town's corrupt sheriff, who had been waiting for him by the stables. A dark plan was already taking shape in her brother's eyes. The war for Red Creek had just begun. The silence that followed the reading of the will was a living thing, a fragile sheet of ice over a deep, dark river of hatred. Sam felt it in the way Clay now watched her from across the dinner table, his eyes cold and flat. She felt it in the whispers of the ranch hands who now looked at her with a mixture of pity and fear. She spent her days in the corrals, her only solace the warm, honest scent of horsehide and hay. She spent time with Phantom, standing just outside his fence, speaking to him in the quiet language of her heart, gathering strength from his untamed spirit. She knew a storm was coming. She just didn't know how fast it would break. It broke on a Tuesday. Sheriff Barlow arrived with Clay at his side, his sweat-stained hat in his hands, and a look of false solemnity on his face. Barlow was a heavy-set man whose authority was measured in the number of whiskey bottles he emptied at the town saloon. Samantha the sheriff began, his voice a gravelly rumble. "We need to have a word." Sam stood on the porch, her hands on her hips, her posture straight and defiant. "Sheriff." "What's this about?" Clay stepped forward, a pained expression artfully arranged on his face. It was a masterful performance. "Sam, just tell them the truth. It'll be easier on you." The truth about what the question hung in the air before Barlow answered it. He unrolled a crumpled bill of sale. "Recognize this your signature clear as day. Selling a dozen of the Red Creek yearlings to a man known to be a rustler. A man we conveniently caught downriver this morning who was all too happy to name his partner." Sam stared at the document. The signature was a crude, deliberate imitation of her own. "That's a lie," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "A pathetic forgery." "Is it?" the sheriff countered smoothly. From behind him, a new ranch hand, a drifter Clay had hired last week, was shoved forward. The boy wouldn't meet her eyes. I saw her, Sheriff," the boy stammered, his gaze fixed on the dirt. "Saw her lead the horses out late last night. She told me she was taking them to the north pasture. The trap was sprung. It was so neat, so tidy, so utterly damning." "You snake," Sam breathed, her eyes locking on Clay. "You spineless, greedy snake." Clay just shook his head, a look of profound disappointment aimed at the sheriff. "See, she's hysterical. The grief, I suppose. It's a terrible thing what it does to a person's character." In the absence of a formal court, Sheriff Barlow declared, his voice taking on a new, hard-edged frontier law. "Allows for swift judgment in cases of this nature, Miss Samantha. And your brother, as co-owner of the damaged property, has the right to determine the punishment." All eyes turned to Clay. He stood there, no longer feigning sadness. In his hand, he held a thick coil of rope. His face was alight with a look of pure, triumphant cruelty. "She'll be taught the lesson our father was too soft to teach her," Clay announced to the gathered ranch hands, his voice ringing with authority. "She'll learn what we do to horse thieves at Red Creek." The hands shifted their faces, a mixture of horror and shame, but none dared to move. They were afraid for their jobs, for their own safety. Barlow's deputies grabbed Sam's arms. She did not plead. She fought. She fought like a cornered wolf, a whirlwind of fury and desperation. She landed a sharp kick to a deputy's knee, and as Clay approached, she spat directly in his face. "You will regret this, Clay." Her defiance only fueled his pleasure. They overpowered her, dragging her into the center of the dusty corral. The scene slowed the world, narrowing to the rough, biting texture of the rope, as Clay himself cinched it tight around her wrists. The knot was a promise of pain. The dust kicked up by their struggle coated her face, but her eyes, tearless and blazing, never left his. He tied the other end to the saddle of a mean-looking gelding. "I doubt it, sister," he sneered, picking up a long leather whip. "I doubt I'll think of you at all." He raised the whip, high its shadow falling over her like the hand of death. The world did not fade to black. It exploded into a universe of pain. The crack of the whip was followed by a sickening lurch, a force so violent it stole the air from Sam's lungs. Her feet were torn from under her, and the hard-packed earth of the corral rose up to meet her with the solid, unforgiving finality of a coffin lid. The first impact was a starburst of agony behind her eyes, a screaming symphony in her shoulders and ribs. The world became a churning, blinding cloud of brown dust and the thunder of hoofbeats just feet from her head. She would not scream. She bit down on her lip, tasting the coppery tang of her own blood, and held the scream in. It was the only thing Clay would not take from her. Her first instinct, born of a life spent with powerful, unpredictable animals, was to get her feet under her, to run with the horse. She twisted her body, fighting the rope, her boots scrabbling for purchase in the loose dirt. For a frantic, impossible moment, she was almost upright, her legs pumping, trying to match the gelding's panicked gait. But the speed was too great, the drag too powerful. Her legs buckled, and she was once again a broken thing being pulled apart by the indifferent horizon. They left the ranch behind a blur of familiar fences and mocking, silent faces. Out on the open plains, the nature of the torture changed. The corral's packed dirt gave way to the brutal honesty of the Badlands. Jagged rocks tore at the flesh of her back and legs, each one a fresh, searing brand. Thorny scrub brush, brittle and sharp, clawed at her, leaving 100 shallow, fiery trails of pain. The sun was a merciless hammer beating down on her, baking the dust and blood into a grotesque crust on her shredded clothes. Time lost its meaning. There was only the rhythm of the horse's hooves and the ceaseless grinding pain. The world became a red haze. Her mind, seeking refuge from the screaming of her nerves, began to drift. She saw her father's face, his kind eyes smiling as he taught her to read the clouds. "Never lose your grit, Sam girl. It's the only thing they can't take." She saw the black, intelligent eye of Phantom, a silent promise of a wildness that matched her own. These images were anchors in a sea of agony. They were the reason she held on. "Breathe," she rasped to herself the word, a puff of dust. Just breathe. Her body, however, was beginning to betray her will. A dull, cold numbness was creeping in from the edges of her consciousness. Her limbs felt heavy, disconnected. The fight was leaving her not in a rush of surrender, but in a slow, seeping tide of exhaustion. The red haze was turning black. She was dying. She knew it. The horse, running now on pure, mindless terror, veered from the open plains. It plunged into a dry, rocky arroyo, its hooves clattering on loose shale. The change in terrain was a new assault. Sam's body was jolted and thrown against the narrow rock-strewn wash. A sharp, white-hot lance of pain shot through her left arm as it struck a protruding ledge. A cry, raw and animal, was finally torn from her throat. She was barely conscious now, a rag doll at the mercy of the rope. She was dragged over another sharp outcrop of shale. She felt a strange scraping vibration travel up the rope. Once, then again. The fibers stretched to their breaking point and, weakened by the constant friction, began to fray. The horse, seeing a clear path ahead, gathered itself and leaped over a 2-foot drop-off. The sudden violent jerk was the final straw. With a sound that was no louder than a dry twig snapping, the rope gave way. Freedom was a moment of weightless, silent flight. It was a dizzying tumble through the air, her body no longer tethered to the engine of its own destruction. She landed in a heap of torn cloth and broken bones at the bottom of the wash, a final merciful darkness swallowing her whole. The horse, suddenly lightened of its terrible burden, galloped on, its hoofbeats fading into the vast, indifferent silence of the plains. The sun beat down. The wind whispered over the pale rocks, and in the bottom of the lonely arroyo Samantha lay utterly still, her blood staining the thirsty ground, a broken promise in a land that offered no mercy. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a slow, agonizing tide of pain, pulling her from a black and dreamless sea. The first thing she knew was the sun. It was a merciless, white-hot weight upon her eyelids, a fire on her skin. Then came the symphony of her own body's screaming protest, a deep, grinding ache in her bones, a sharp electric fire in her left arm that made the world flash white with every beat of her heart, and the thirst, a terrible clawing dryness that felt as though her throat had been packed with sand and dust. She tried to move, and a groan, raw and animal, was torn from her. Her clothes were ribbons of torn fabric caked with blood and dirt. Her back and legs were a raw, shredded map of her ordeal. She was wreckage, a broken thing left for the buzzards. The thought of Clay, his triumphant sneer, was a hot coal in her gut. It was that coal that gave her the strength to push herself up onto her good elbow. The world swam in a dizzying, nauseating blur. Water. The thought was not a word, but a primal command from the deepest part of her soul. Live. It was then that she saw him. On a low ridge not 50 yards away, silhouetted against the unforgiving blue of the sky, stood Phantom. He was not a dream. He was a creature of breathtaking, impossible reality. He stood like a statue carved from obsidian, his black coat shimmering in the heat, his head high, watching her. There was no threat in his posture, only a deep, unnerving stillness, an ancient watchfulness. He had not abandoned her. He had waited. As her vision cleared, she saw a dark, ragged gash high on his flank, where a splintered fence post must have torn him during his escape from the ranch. The sight created a strange, immediate kinship. They were two survivors in this vast, empty church of stone and sun. Two broken pieces of the same legacy. She knew with a certainty that defied logic that he was her only way out of this hell. "Okay, big fellow," she whispered, her voice a dry, cracking rustle. Okay. Getting to her feet was a monumental task, a war waged against every screaming nerve. Her left arm was useless, a dead weight of agony. She cradled it against her chest and began to stumble, using the wall of the arroyo for support. Phantom watched her for a moment, then turned and began to walk, not away from her, but along the ridge, his pace slow and deliberate. He glanced back, a clear and unmistakable invitation. Follow. She had no strength left for doubt. She followed. He led her for what felt like an eternity, a slow, agonizing pilgrimage through the desolate landscape. He led her to a place the sun barely touched, a narrow fissure in a high rock wall, where green moss clung to the cool, damp stone. And at its base, a small, clear seep of water trickling into a shallow basin. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She fell to her knees and drank the water, a cool, clean miracle on her parched tongue. She drank until she could drink no more, then splashed the water on her face, washing away the crust of blood and dirt. For 2 days they existed in this fragile truce. She was the ghost. He was the stallion. She used her father's knowledge, her hands searching for the familiar shapes of leaves. She found Yarrow chewing the leaves into a bitter poultice to pack into her deepest wounds to stave off infection. She found the broad, soothing leaves of comfrey near the water seep. It was while she was grinding these leaves between two stones that he came down from the ridge. He walked toward her, not with the cautious distance of before, but with a purpose. He stopped a few feet away, his great head lowered slightly, his gaze fixed on her. He was offering her a choice, a test of trust. "You too, huh?" she murmured, her voice still raw. She looked at the gash on his flank. It was inflamed, angry-looking. "That bastard hurt you too." Slowly, carefully, she rose, holding the green pulpy mash in her good hand. "This might sting a bit," she said, her voice a low, soothing hum. "But it'll help. I promise. We're in this together, you and I." She took a step toward him. He flinched, his powerful muscles twitching, but he did not bolt. Another step. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could smell the wild, clean scent of him. She reached out her hand. His skin trembled at her touch, a ripple of distrust and memory. But he stood his ground. He allowed her to gently, carefully press the cool, healing poultice into his wound. He let out a low, shuddering breath, a sound of pain and release. In that moment, the barrier between them dissolved. That night, a cold wind howled through the canyons. They took shelter in a shallow cave, a hollowed-out space behind a curtain of ancient, petrified roots. Sam shivered, the deep cold of her injuries settling into her bones. Phantom, after a long, watchful moment, stepped deeper into the cave and lay down his massive body, creating a wall against the wind. His warmth was a living, breathing fire. She slept, huddled near him, the rhythm of his great slow breaths, the only sound in the world. She awoke to his explosive snort. A pair of hungry yellow eyes gleamed from the darkness beyond the cave, a coyote drawn by the scent of blood. Before she could even scramble for a rock, Phantom was on his feet, a force of pure, protective fury. He stomped a heavy hoof, a sound like a boulder splitting, and let out a piercing, challenging scream that sent the predator slinking back into the night. He had saved her life. The next day she was stronger. The fever from her wounds had broken. He allowed her to clean his gash again, and she saw that it was beginning to heal. The final barrier of trust fell away. She stood beside him, her hand resting on his powerful shoulder. There was no rope, no saddle, no bridle. There was only the vast, silent land and the unspoken language between them. He turned his great head and looked at her, and in his dark, intelligent eyes she saw not a beast to be broken, but a partner to be met. He dipped his head, a clear and final invitation. Using a low rock for purchase, she pulled herself onto his bare back. The feel of his warm, solid strength beneath her was dizzying. He stood still, allowing her to find her balance, her hands resting lightly on his withers. Then, as if they had done this 1,000 times before they moved. They started at a walk, then a trot, and then out on the open plain he broke into a gallop. It was not a run of panic, but of pure, unadulterated freedom. It was a flight, a resurrection. The wind whipped through Sam's hair, tearing away the last of the pain, and the fear replacing it with a wild, soaring power. From the top of a high butte, she stopped him. They stood, two lone figures overlooking the world. She looked back toward the distant, hazy spot on the horizon that was Red Creek. The memory of Clay's face of the rope of the dust was still there, but it was no longer a source of terror. It was fuel. A victim had been dragged from that ranch. A warrior would be returning. She leaned forward, her voice a low, fierce whisper against his neck. Clay. She turned Phantom, and they began the long journey home. The journey home was a pilgrimage in reverse. Sam rode not as a frightened girl seeking refuge, but as a creature of grit and scars, her father's daughter remade by the land's brutal caress. The sun had baked the softness from her, and the desert had taught her a new language of survival. She was a ghost, returning to a house that believed her dead, and she was not alone. Phantom moved beneath her like a rolling storm cloud, a force of nature, now bound to her will, not by leather and steel, but by a shared memory of pain and a silent promise of retribution. As they crested the final ridge, the familiar beloved shape of the Red Creek Valley spread out below. The sight of it, the green pastures and the winding river, sent a sharp, clean pang of grief through her. But the grief was now edged with iron. Below in the main yard, a crowd was gathered. Fine carriages from town gleamed in the afternoon sun. It was a party, a celebration, a vulture's feast held upon her grave. Rage as cold and clear as mountain water settled in her heart. She urged Phantom forward. Down below, Clay was performing. He stood on a makeshift stage, a glass of whiskey in his hand, charming the wealthy investors who had come to pick over the bones of his family's legacy. He was selling the North Pasture, the heart of Red Creek's grazing land. A new era of progress, he was booming his voice slick with false sentiment. We move forward, unburdened by the past. Then the crowd's attention shifted. A single person pointed toward the ridge. A murmur spread a wave of unease that silenced the auctioneer. All eyes turned upward. She came down from the hill like a specter of judgment. The scarred woman on the legendary black stallion. They didn't gallop. They descended at a slow, deliberate walk that was more menacing than any charge. The crowd parted before them, a sea of stunned faces. She rode directly into the center of the gathering, stopping only when Phantom stood before the platform where her brother was frozen, his face a bloodless mask of disbelief. He had left her for dead. This was not possible. Recovering his wits, he forced a sneer. "Well, well." He spat, his voice a tremor of fear wrapped in arrogance. "Look what the buzzards dragged in. Come back to beg for scraps." Little Sister Sam's voice, when she spoke, was a low, cold thing that cut through the silence. "I've come back for what's mine, Clay." Sheriff Barlow, his face slick with sweat, stepped forward. "Now hold on, Sam," he blustered. "You're a wanted fugitive." Her gaze fell upon him, and he physically recoiled. "You are a bought man, Sheriff," she said with chilling finality. "Your authority here means less than the dust on my boots. This is between me and him." She looked back at Clay. "Red Creek is mine." Clay shrieked, his composure shattering. "The law says so." "The law," Sam's laugh was a bitter, broken sound. "You speak of law. Our father's law was one of worth. He left one final test." She patted Phantom's powerful neck, and the horse snorted a deep rumble of agreement. "You want this ranch, Clay. You want the name, then prove you deserve it. Not with forged papers and a coward's rope. Prove it like a man." She pointed a scarred finger toward the highest, most treacherous peak overlooking the valley, a landmark they called the Widow's Peak. "I challenge you," she declared, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. "A race. From here to the top of the Widow's Peak and back. Winner takes all. The ranch, the brand, the name. The loser leaves Red Creek before sunset and never returns." She leaned forward, her eyes burning into his. "Unless you're a coward too afraid to ride against a ghost." The challenge was a gauntlet thrown at his feet in front of everyone. His investors, the ranch hands, the entire town. He was trapped. His pride, the fragile, bloated thing he had built his life upon, would not allow him to refuse. He threw back his head and roared with laughter, a harsh, ugly sound. "A race! You think that half-wild devil can beat a true thoroughbred?" He turned to the crowd, his arrogance flooding back. "Fine, I accept. I will prove once and for all who is the master of Red Creek." He pointed a shaking finger at her. "And when I win, I'll see you hang myself. Properly this time." The final battle was set. Without another word, Sam met his hateful gaze with the calm of a winter stone. Then, with a gentle touch, she turned Phantom. Together they walked toward the open plains to the starting line of a race for the soul of Red Creek. A single gunshot from the sheriff's pistol ripped through the air, and the race began. Clay, on his prized Kentucky thoroughbred, shot forward like a bolt from a crossbow. He was a tempest of flailing whips and shouted curses, his desperation churning the dust into a frantic cloud. Across the open flats, his horse's raw speed gave him an immediate commanding lead. He glanced back, a triumphant sneer on his face. "Is that all the ghost has, sister?" He roared, his words snatched by the wind. My father should have known better than to bet on a wild beast. Sam did not answer. She did not push Phantom. She leaned low over his powerful neck, her hands resting lightly, her legs her only guide. She let him run. It was a fluid, ground-devouring rhythm, a display of power held in reserve. She could feel the stallion's great heart hammering, not with fear, but with a fierce, joyful energy. She trusted him. The race, she knew, would not be won on the flats. It would be won on the mountain. As they reached the base of Widow's Peak, the terrain shifted violently. The open plain gave way to a narrow, treacherous switchback path carved into the mountainside, littered with loose rock and sharp, unforgiving drops. Here, speed was a liability. Here, only trust and courage mattered. Clay's lead vanished. His thoroughbred, bred for flat tracks, grew nervous, its elegant steps faltering on the unstable ground. Phantom, however, came alive. This was his world. He moved with the nimble, sure-footed grace of a mountain goat, his powerful hooves finding purchase where there seemed to be none. He closed the gap with terrifying speed. Seeing Sam draw level, Clay's arrogance curdled into raw panic. "Get back, you witch!" he screamed, savagely whipping his own struggling horse. He tried to steer his mount into Sam's path, to block her, to force her toward the crumbling edge. But Sam and Phantom moved as one. A slight pressure from her knee, a low word whispered into his ear, and the stallion would respond instantly. They flowed around Clay's clumsy attacks, a black ribbon of grace and fury against the stone. They were not a rider and a horse. They were a single, perfect weapon. They reached the windswept summit of the peak almost together, the turnaround point marked by a single, gnarled pine tree. The entire valley spread out below them, a kingdom waiting for its true ruler. As they made the tight turn, Clay made his final desperate play. "If I can't have it," he shrieked, his face a mask of madness. "No one will." He wrenched his horse's head around, steering it directly into Phantom's side, a suicidal attempt to shove them both off the narrow ledge and into the abyss. Phantom, at Sam's silent command, did not shy away. He planted his feet, his body becoming an immovable wall of muscle, and met the charge. The impact was a dull, heavy thud. Clay's thoroughbred, exhausted and terrified, reared back from the collision, its hooves scraping wildly on the loose scree. It lost its footing. With a final terrified scream that held no triumph, only a pathetic plea, Clay was thrown from the saddle. He did not fall into the abyss. He tumbled down the steep, shale-covered slope, his body a broken doll coming to rest in a heap of shattered bone and pride far below. Sam watched him fall, her face impassive. She had not won by force. She had won by worth. She and Phantom descended the mountain not at a race pace, but with the slow, solemn dignity of victors. When she reached the bottom, the crowd stood in stunned silence. The loyal old ranch hand, his face wet with tears, stepped forward. He told me the old man's voice trembled, but it was clear for all to hear, before the will was even read. He told me he'd find a way to get rid of her. The sheriff turned to run, but the other ranch hands, their shame finally burned away by the sight of true courage, moved to block his path. The lie was broken. The truth was out. Sam rode through the silent crowd and stopped before the main house. She slid from Phantom's back, her feet planting firmly on the soil of Red Creek. She laid a hand on her stallion's neck, and together they looked out over the land. It was scarred. It was wounded. But it was theirs. The war was over. And she had won. The dust has settled. The traitor has paid his price, and Red Creek finally belongs to its true heir. So I ask you, what was the real legacy her father left behind the sprawling ranch, or the unbreakable will to fight for it? If Sam and Phantom's race for justice left you breathless, hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. And you better cinch your saddles tight, because next week we're heading deep into the mysterious forests with the story of Ezra and Liliana. A lonely trapper finds a mute girl chained to a river raft. But her silence hides a deadly secret, and the men hunting her are more dangerous than any beast in the woods. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss this breathtaking journey of survival.